It is. We got Dan Del Rio and Chuck Caraway from Del Rio and Caraway here to help us out with some legal questions on stories we have in the news. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us. Appreciate it. I want to start with this first one. There was an interesting case up in Washington. A protester during the George Floyd aftermath, a Black Lives Matter protester, hit and killed on the highway during a protest, was recently awarded $6 million. Explain all the legal surrounding this.
So this was interesting. Like you said, it was back during the 2020 protests. They had become so disruptive in the area that the state had announced they were closing down part of I-5 because of all the protests. They were already occurring there. So for about 15 days on and off during June, July, they went ahead and closed down the freeway for protests. This was one of those days. So the protesters were up there, they were doing their thing, and the police had basically blocked off all the freeway on-ramps. The driver who was involved ended up going up instead an off-ramp, flipping a 180, coming down through right the middle of the protesters, struck two of them, injuring one, killing another. So that's kind of the factual underpinning of how we got here. The family of the deceased protester went ahead and sued. They, of course, sued the driver, but they also went ahead and sued the state, saying that the state should have done more to prevent vehicle traffic in the area. The state kind of went back and said, look, you never should have been on the freeway in the first place. There's no circumstance where pedestrians are allowed on the freeway. It's dangerous. They retorted with saying, well, but wait, you closed down the freeway just so we could do this. Yeah. You did it for us. You sanctioned it by doing that. So it was very interesting the way that the verdict was coming out. They asked for $24 million against the state. I can't remember the amount they asked against the driver, but they ended up getting 6 against him. And then there was also the claim of whether the protesters themselves were negligent for being there. The jury came out and said the protesters were not negligent, so they bought into their argument that it was basically sanctioned. But they also said the state wasn't negligent, that the state had done what was reasonable in blocking off the entrances, that the conduct of the driver was so outrageous in basically going up an off-ramp and flipping around and coming back through traffic that it couldn't have been expected.
So the jury essentially finds a middle ground. I'm always curious, though, when you hear, and I don't know the financial situation of the driver in this case, guessing they don't have $6 million. What happens? Does it end up just being a symbolic?
So, yeah, there's kind of you can have very much where it's a symbolic, what they call the legacy verdict kind of idea that, we're proving that they were in the right. Or if you're incredibly fortunate, there are a couple scenarios where you can still have insurance coverage for something like this if there's a bad faith scenario. But it's fairly rare.
Okay, I want to quickly get to another one. A tragic situation here in Sacramento, a person hit and killed by a SAC RT bus. As far as I know now, there's no lawsuit on this, but do we see one in the future, or is it just sometimes bad things happen?
So this is hard. It's not much known about how the circumstances of this came about, except that someone else was also killed in the same means in the same area recently. So there's going to be a lot of questions raised. Obviously, questions of driver negligence. Was the pedestrian where they should have been? Is there any comparative fault? But then also, if you get to the point that there are enough similar accidents in a certain, let's say, like intersection, there becomes questions of whether the intersection itself is safe. Do we have to look at better traffic controls? Does it have full stoplights? Was there anything else we should do? I know there's turning some intersections in Sacramento area into those roundabouts, trying to figure out other ways to deal with the pedestrian traffic.
All right, so Chuck, I want to ask you about this one. A case where a woman finds out she is on the no-fly list for American Airlines. Turns out she's mistakenly on the list, but this is just sort of the beginning of this story.
So this is a much more lighthearted story in a way, obviously. But what happens is that she shows up to go to her sister's bachelorette party and finds out that she's on the do-not-fly list for one particular airline. And so she asks why. They can't tell her why. She ends up buying a ticket on another flight and then making it
to get there.
Yeah. So she's thinking to herself, well, I'm just going to get refunded by this once this all gets figured out. Long story short, she calls in. They eventually tell her what the situation is, and it's something that just really can't happen. And so she appeals it. It takes her, I think she said she's 3 months into the process before they finally say, obviously this wasn't you, based off the
They admit that they got it wrong, essentially.
Exactly. But the issue here is they still haven't given her a refund. We've talked about this a couple of different times here, where now the law says, if something like this happens, there's an automatic refund. I'm going to assume that this happened before that law was passed, and so now she's having to go through the process. I looked it up, and what you have to do is you have to go through appeal of the Department of Homeland Security, and then you have to go through the Department of Transportation and make a complaint in order to try to get that refund. But also the Department of Homeland Security, if you do end up on the no-fly list, that's the way that you get off the no-fly list. You do an appeal to them, and then they assess you, kind of they do with the TSA pre-check, and they determine you're not a security threat. The issue with all of this is that there's no refund that's just given to you.
Yeah.
And two, they never really tell you why you were on it or when you're off of it. You just have to go try to buy another ticket and hopefully make the flight.
You basically wonder how many people will just give up and say, forget it, I won't get my refund. Gentlemen, thank you so much for the expertise. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Courtney? Yeah.